One ship fought at Jutland in 1916 and at Normandy in 1944. One ship survived a mine, a bomb, a guided missile, and more naval gunfire duels than any vessel afloat. One ship earned more battle honours than any other in the 500-year history of the Royal Navy. Her name was HMS Warspite. Not the story of a class of ships, not a fleet. One single warship, laid down in the age of cavalry charges and coal dust, that fought her way through virtually every theatre of both world wars, absorbed hits from weapons spanning the entire evolution of modern warfare, and then, when they finally tried to tow her to the scrapyard, broke free of her cables and ran herself aground on the coast of England, as if she simply refused to die. No other warship in any navy, in any era, comes close. She was laid down on 31st October 1912 at Devonport Royal Dockyard, the fourth of 5 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships built during the furious Anglo-German naval arms race that was dragging Europe toward catastrophe. She slid into the water on the 26th of November 1913, christened with a name the Royal Navy had carried since the days of Elizabeth.I, possibly derived from an Old English word for a woodpecker, though some trace it to Warspite, a vessel built for the express purpose of spiting the enemy. Shakespeare used the word. 7 previous ships had borne it. None of them would come close to what this 8th Warspite would endure. She was commissioned in March 1915, 8 months into a world war nobody expected to last, and she carried on her crest a Latin motto that reads like a dare: Belli, dura, despicio. I despise the hard knocks of war. She meant it. Her designers gave her 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, each capable of hurling a shell weighing nearly a ton over 20,000 yards. The Queen Elizabeth class was revolutionary. The first capital ships powered entirely by oil instead of coal, making them the fastest battleships in the Grand Fleet. But it wasn't speed or firepower that would make Warspite extraordinary. It was something no engineer could blueprint, something stubborn, something almost alive. The Battle of Jutland, 31st of May 1916, the largest naval battle of the First World War and the only full-scale clash between the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet. Over 250 ships spread across the grey North Sea off the coast of Denmark. Warspite sailed into that maelstrom as part of the 5th Battle Squadron under Rear Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas, commanded by Captain Edward Philpotts. And then everything went wrong. During the running engagement between the British and German battle lines, Warspite's steering gear jammed. Hard to port, her rudder locked, and 30,000 tons of battleship began an involuntary full circle, spinning, helpless, directly under the concentrated fire of the German fleet. German capital ships, including vessels of the König class, poured salvo after salvo into her. Shell splashes erupted around her like a forest of white columns. For agonizing minutes, she couldn't break free, couldn't evade, couldn't do anything except take it. 15 large-caliber shells struck her. 15. From guns designed to sink ships exactly like her. Shells tore through hull plating, wrecked compartments, started fires, punched clean through her superstructure. But here's the thing. During that wild, uncontrolled loop, something happened that turned disaster into something almost like grace. The armoured cruiser HMS Warrior had been taking devastating fire from the German line, on the verge of destruction, her crew dying by the minute. Warspite's involuntary circle carried her directly between Warrior and the German guns. The German gunners, presented with a bigger, closer target, shifted their fire. Every salvo that hit Warspite was a salvo that didn't hit Warrior. She absorbed the punishment meant for a dying ship and took it onto herself. Nobody planned it. Nobody ordered it. But it was the first demonstration of the quality that would define her entire career. She could take hits that would destroy other ships and keep fighting. 14 killed, including 1 officer. 16 wounded, including 3. Given 15 hits from battleship-caliber shells, those casualty figures seem almost impossibly low. A credit to her armoured construction, to the men who built her at Devonport, to the sheer bloody-minded toughness of a hull that refused to break. Warspite limped back to Rosyth under her own power, battered, listing, alive. The First World War ended without giving her another engagement on the scale of Jutland. Didn't matter. In a single afternoon, the legend had begun. Between the wars, she served with the Atlantic Fleet and later the Mediterranean Fleet. Flag-showing cruises, fleet exercises, the slow peacetime routine that settled over the Royal Navy's aging dreadnoughts like fog. Treaties limited new construction. Budgets shrank. Great warships rusted quietly at their moorings, while politicians argued about tonnage ratios. Warspite could easily have been pensioned off, reduced to a training hulk, or sold for scrap like so many of her contemporaries. But the Admiralty wasn't finished with her. In 1934, Warspite entered Portsmouth Dockyard for a modernization so radical, so extensive, that it took until March 1937 to complete. 3 years in the yard. When she emerged, she was virtually unrecognizable. The old cage masts and paired funnels, that distinctive silhouette of the Jutland era, were gone entirely. In their place stood a modern tower bridge structure that transformed her profile from the waterline up. Her 15-inch guns were modified to increase their maximum elevation, which extended their range significantly. New fire control systems replaced the old mechanical computers. Improved anti-aircraft armament bristled from her superstructure, a concession to the threat that aircraft now posed to capital ships. Additional deck armour was bolted on, and she gained something she'd never had before: hangars and a catapult for carrying 4 aircraft, turning her into a self-contained reconnaissance platform. This wasn't a coat of paint. It wasn't an upgrade. It was a resurrection. A First World War hull carrying Second World War fighting capability. Without that refit, Warspite would have been a floating museum by 1940. Too slow, too blind, too vulnerable to air attack to survive in a modern war. With it, she was ready for another 30 years' worth of violence, compressed into 6. And violence came fast. 13th of April, 1940. The German invasion of Norway was barely 4 days old. 3 days earlier, a force of British destroyers had fought a fierce engagement in the narrow waters of Ofotfjord near the port of Narvik, inflicting damage but taking losses, and a number of German destroyers remained in the fjord, wounded, trapped, but still dangerous. The Admiralty's solution was beautifully blunt: send Warspite. She led 9 destroyers into that fjord. Picture it: a narrow, winding channel flanked by snow-covered mountains rising steeply from the waterline. The kind of confined space where a battleship's sheer size should be a death sentence rather than an advantage. 1 torpedo from a hidden submarine, 1 mine in the channel, and she'd have been finished. It was audacious, reckless maybe, and it worked spectacularly. Her 15-inch guns thundered against the trapped German destroyers, while her escorts pressed the attack with torpedoes and gunfire. By day's end, 8 German destroyers had been sunk or scuttled in the fjord. The Second Battle of Narvik was a decisive British victory in what was otherwise a dismal campaign. One detail from Narvik deserves its own moment. Before the main engagement, Warspite catapulted her fairy swordfish floatplane for reconnaissance, a slow, fabric-covered biplane that already looked like an antique in 1940. That swordfish spotted the German submarine U-64 lurking in Herjungsfjord, a sidearm of the main waterway. It attacked, dropped bombs, sank U-64, one of the very first U-boat kills by aircraft in the entire war. A ship built before the First World War, carrying a plane that looked like it belonged in the First World War, sinking a submarine in the opening months of the Second. The layers of anachronism were almost absurd. Warspite didn't care about anachronism, she cared about results. Summer 1940, France had fallen, Italy had entered the war. The Mediterranean became one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth, and Warspite was right in the middle of it, flagship of the Mediterranean fleet. On July 9, 1940, she fought in the Battle of Calabria off southern Italy, and during the exchange of fire at extreme range, she did something that gunnery officers still talk about. One of her 15-inch shells struck the Italian battleship Giulio Cesare at a range of 26,000 yards. 26,000 yards, nearly 13 nautical miles. A shell weighing close to a ton lofted in a parabolic arc across that distance, finding its mark on a ship moving at speed. One of the longest-range hits ever scored by one moving warship on another in the history of naval warfare. The hit caused a fire aboard Giulio Cesare and prompted the Italian admiral to break off and withdraw. At 25 years old, Warspite could still reach out and touch someone harder than almost anything else afloat. If Calabria was Warspite at maximum range, Cape Matapan was Warspite at knife-fighting distance. The night of 28th to 29th March 1941, waters south of Greece. Admiral Sir Andrew Browne Cunningham, arguably the greatest Royal Navy commander of the Second World War, flew his flag aboard Warspite as he led the Mediterranean fleet to intercept an Italian force centred on the battleship Vittorio Veneto. British intelligence, aided by ultra-decrypts, had revealed the Italian sortie. Cunningham brought Warspite, Barham, Valiant and the carrier Formidable. A torpedo strike from Formidable's aircraft crippled the Italian heavy cruiser Pola. The Italian Navy sent two more heavy cruisers, Fiume and Zara, along with destroyers back to help her. They sailed directly into Cunningham's battle line. What followed wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The British battleships caught the Italian cruisers at 3,500 yards. Barely 2 miles. An almost unimaginable range for capital ships, close enough to see the enemy's hull without binoculars. The British had radar, the Italians did not. They had no idea the battleships were there until searchlights snapped on and the 15-inch broadsides began. Warspite's guns fired into Fiume at point-blank range, and the effect of those enormous shells on a cruiser's comparatively thin armour was catastrophic. Steel plates peeled open, magazines detonated. Fiume, Zara and Pola all sunk. The destroyers Vittorio Alfieri and Giosuè Carducci sunk. Over 2,300 Italian sailors killed in minutes. Cape Matapan broke the Italian surface fleet. The Regia Marina never again sortied in strength to challenge the Royal Navy in the eastern Mediterranean. And it was Warspite, Cunningham's flagship, the old veteran of Jutland, that led the killing blow. Cunningham was deeply attached to this ship. It was he who gave her the nickname that stuck forever, the Grand Old Lady. But there was no rest. Weeks later, in May 1941, the German airborne assault on Crete dragged the Mediterranean fleet into a desperate evacuation under relentless Luftwaffe air attack. The skies over Crete belonged to the Germans, and every ship in the evacuation force was a target. Warspite was there, providing cover, when on 22nd of May a bomb struck her, likely a 500-pounder, causing significant damage and forcing her to withdraw. She needed repairs the overstretched Mediterranean dockyards couldn't provide, so they sent her halfway around the world, through the Suez Canal, across the Indian Ocean, across the Pacific to the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington, where American shipyard workers repaired a British battleship older than most of them were. When she returned to service, she didn't go back to the Mediterranean, not yet. She joined the Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean under Admiral Sir James Somerville, serving as flagship, operating from Kilindini in East Africa and later from Ceylon. The Japanese threat loomed after the fall of Singapore and the devastating carrier raid into the Indian Ocean in April 1942, and Warspite stood guard. Her time in the Indian Ocean was quieter than the Mediterranean. The Japanese didn't press west with the force that had been feared, but her presence there completes a map that defies belief. North Sea, Atlantic, Norwegian fjords, Mediterranean, Indian Ocean. There was no major body of water where the Royal Navy fought that Warspite hadn't been. And then came Salerno. This is where the story shifts from remarkable to something else entirely. September 1943, back in the Mediterranean, supporting the Allied invasion of mainland Italy. Her 15-inch guns were pounding German positions ashore as desperate counterattacks threatened to push the Salerno beachhead back into the sea. On September 16th, high above her, a Dornier Do 217 bomber released something that didn't belong in 1943. It was called the Fritz X, formerly the Ruhrstahl S D-1-400. A 1,400-kilogram armor-piercing bomb fitted with a radio control guidance system and cruciform tail fins. An operator in the bomber watched a bright flare mounted on the bomb's tail and steered it by radio signal after release, adjusting its trajectory in real time as it fell. This wasn't a dumb bomb tumbling under gravity. This was one of the world's first precision-guided munitions, an early ancestor of the smart bombs and guided missiles that would transform warfare in subsequent decades. A weapon of the future, dropped on a ship of the past. The Fritz X struck Warspite. It punched straight through her deck armor and detonated deep inside the ship in the vicinity of her boiler rooms. The explosion was devastating. 6 boiler rooms flooded almost immediately. She lost steam power. A severe list developed as 5,000 tons of seawater poured into her hull. 9 of her crew were killed, 14 wounded. Damage control parties fought to shore up bulkheads, counter-flood to correct the list, keep the flooding from spreading to adjacent compartments. For a terrible stretch of hours, it looked like the thing that would finally kill Warspite wouldn't be a battleship shell or a conventional bomb, but a weapon that hadn't even existed when her keel was laid. To understand how lethal the Fritz X truly was, look at what it had done exactly 1 week earlier. On September 9th, 1943, a Fritz X struck the Italian battleship Roma as she sailed to surrender following the Italian armistice. The bomb penetrated Roma's deck, reached her forward magazine, and detonated the ammunition stores. Roma exploded and broke apart. Over 1,300 men died, including the Italian fleet commander, Admiral Carlo Bergamini. Roma was a modern battleship, newer, more heavily armed, in many respects more capable than Warspite. The Fritz X killed Roma outright. Warspite, older, scarred, already carrying the accumulated damage of Jutland and Crete and a dozen other engagements, took the same weapon and survived. She was towed to Malta, then Gibraltar, then home to Britain. The damage was so severe she was never fully repaired. Her speed was permanently reduced. Some boiler rooms were simply sealed off and abandoned, never restored. She'd never again be the fast, maneuverable battleship she'd once been, a ship that by any rational assessment should have been retired. But they didn't scrap her. They patched her up, jury-rigged what they could, accepted her limitations, and sent her back to war. Because the grand old lady still had work to do. June 6th, 1944. The largest amphibious invasion in human history crossed the English Channel toward the beaches of Normandy. Warspite was there, assigned to Bombardment Force D of the Eastern Naval Task Force, supporting the landings at Sword Beach, where British troops of the 3rd Infantry Division stormed ashore against German fortifications. A ship that fought at Jutland in 1916 was firing her guns at Normandy in 1944. 28 years separated those two engagements, nearly 3 decades of service, of war and peace and war again, of shell hits and bomb hits and a guided missile hit. She was older than many of the soldiers wading through the surf below her guns, older than many of their fathers had been when they served in the First War. Battered, jury-rigged, never fully repaired after the Fritz X, her speed a shadow of what it once was. And still her 15-inch guns roared against German shore batteries and concrete emplacements, her massive shells demolishing fortified positions that no destroyer's gun or field artillery piece could crack. Those guns had been designed to penetrate battleship armour. Turned against concrete and earth, they were annihilating. She wasn't done even then. On June 13th, a week after D-Day, she struck a magnetic mine while operating off the beachhead. The explosion ripped into her hull and caused yet more severe damage. Damage piled on damage, piled on damage. Layer after layer of punishment that would have sent any lesser ship to the breaker's yard years ago. Another weapon on the list of things that tried and failed to kill HMS Warspite. She was repaired, again, just enough, and she returned to bombard German positions at Le Havre and at Walcheren in the final months of the European War. Still fighting, still shooting, still refusing. Shells, bombs, a guided missile, a mine, a steering jam under the concentrated fire of the German high seas fleet. 30 years of active service across 2 world wars, every major theatre of war, and more engagements than any single warship had any right to survive. By the time the guns finally fell silent in 1945, HMS Warspite had earned 15 battle honours, more than any other ship in the Royal Navy's entire history. A history stretching back to the reign of Henry VII in the late 15th century. 15 honours. 500 years of tradition. No ship had ever matched that record. None has since. And then they tried to scrap her. In 1946, Warspite was sold to the breakers. A tug took her under tow, bound for the shipbreaking yards. The same fate that had already claimed so many of her sisters and contemporaries, reduced to razor blades and scrap steel. She'd survived everything the German and Italian navies could throw at her. She'd survived weapons that hadn't been invented when her keel plates were riveted together in 1912. She did not go quietly. Under tow, in heavy weather off the south coast of England, Warspite broke free of her cables. She drifted, masterless, driven by wind and current, onto the rocks at Prussia Cove, near St. Michael's Mount, on the coast of Cornwall. And there she stuck, grounded, immovable. She settled on the rocks and refused to be moved. The sea had her now, and the rocks, and she wasn't going anywhere she didn't choose to go. They had to break her up where she lay, piece by piece, on that Cornish shore. Even that took years. Her hull was that strong, that stubborn, that unwilling to yield, even in death. She'd fought her last battle, against the breakers themselves, and she'd won, at least long enough to make them come to her. Some ships serve, some ships fight. Warspite did both for 3 decades across every ocean against every weapon the 20th century could devise, and she took every single hit and kept going. Belli dura despicio. I despise the hard knocks of war. She didn't just despise them, she absorbed them, all of them. And when the last hard knock came, not from an enemy shell, but from a scrapper's tow cable, she shrugged that off too. The grand old lady. 15 battle honours, 2 world wars, every theatre, every weapon known to modern naval warfare, from dreadnought-era armour-piercing shells to one of the first guided missiles ever fired in anger. And one final grounding on a rocky Cornish coast that said, louder than any broadside she ever fired, that HMS Warspite would leave on her own terms or not at all. They don't build them like that anymore. They never did. There was only ever one Warspite. If this story hit you the way it hit us, subscribe. We've got more like it coming.